Bonjour, Candy Bochuka Edition Cause. My name is Standing Bear.
Bonjour, I'm Joseph Robillard.
And welcome to Fort William Historical Park's Heritage Highlights. Today we'll be making Mukuks or birch bark baskets. In Anishinaabe it means box or container. It is traditionally a birch bark basket that is sewn together using spruce root or watap and has a rim made out of either cedar, red osier dogwood, or more spruce root. Baskets serve many purposes. So one of them includes storage of items like wild rice or maple sugar. As well, you can also fold them in a certain way that will be able to retain water. Before Europeans introduced iron pots to the indigenous populations, one of the ways that we would boil water is heat up rocks and transfer them into baskets that are folded in this way. So wigwas, or birch bark, is usually harvested towards the end of June and early July in our region. And the way that you tell it's the time of year to do that is when you start to see the fireflies start to appear out at night. So, when you want to harvest birch bark off of a tree, and let's just say this is a birch tree behind me, what you're going to do is cut a straight line down the tree and have a horizontal slash on either end of the size of the sheet of bark that you want, and you should be able to pry it off with your hands. Now, when you cut into the tree, you should hear sort of a loud popping or cracking sound. Alright, the other ingredient you're going to need is some watap or spruce root. Now, to harvest spruce root, you have to go to a black spruce bog, and you're going to dig down into sphagnum moss and find roots probably about the thickness of your pinky, follow them along and pull them out. Afterwards, you have to shave off the bark, soak them in water, split them, and then store them away in nice coils like this. Afterwards, whenever you want to use your spruce root, all you have to do is soak it in water for a couple of hours and it should be soft and pliable. Now for today, what we're going to be making is a basket roughly about this size. My hands today is actually going to be my good friend Joseph. And the reason for that is from working with birch bark and other materials like this over the years, I've developed an intolerance to it. So he's going to be my hands today as we talk about the process of doing a nice, simple design.
All right, let's talk tools. So very simple to make a mukuk. You're only going to need two different tools. A square awl, like this one here, and a knife.
Now, indigenous peoples have been making tools before European contact, including out of stone, bone, and even copper. Now, along the south shore of Lake Superior or Kichigami, indigenous peoples were harvesting copper for about 9,000 years at this point. And they could make things such as the square awl and a copper knife. Now Joseph is going to demonstrate how to split some cedar wood. Make sure the blade is facing down. And he's just feeling out of the wood. If you notice that the cedar is splitting towards one direction more than the other, you want to put pressure on the fatter side. Now, you want to keep on splitting your cedar down until you get it to about 3/4 of an inch wide and about 1/8 of an inch thick. In order to get your spruce root ready, you're going to soak it in water first for a couple of hours. Now, all you need to do is cut a little notch at the tip of your spruce root and then use your fingers and thumbs to pry it apart. Very similarly to the cedar, you want to keep equal pressure on both sides of the root. Now the best root splitters have a feel for it and can do the blindfolded. Next, you're going to cut out this square roughly about 10 inches by 10 inches long. Next, you're going to take your sheet of bark and dip it into some warm water so you can clean out the outside edge and thin it out. The water is going to help separate the layers of bark. So Joseph is going to mark out the spots he's going to be cutting into, which is roughly about 2.5 inches from the corner at about a 45-degree angle. Now you can adjust the distance and that will change the shape and size of your mukuk. Now next, he's going to cut out from those points out towards the corner. Now you can also do this with scissors. However, just be wary not to cut right to the edge or the tip of the scissors because that'll cause your bark to split. So next, you're going to dip your sheet back into the water just to give it a little bit of warmth and start to carefully fold up the sides. Now be careful about the folds so that it doesn't crack along the edge. Now Joseph here is going to be using a clip made out of a sapling, but what you can use at home is either a butterfly clip or some clothespins. While you're preparing the shape of your basket, what you're going to be wanting to do is soak your cedar in some hot water, just to give it a little bit of flexibility and it makes it malleable so that you can bend it into shape along with the shape of your basket. Now you want to measure it out so that there's about a 2 to 3 inch overlap with the rim on the exterior, and same with the interior. Next, Joseph is going to stitch up the sides. So he's going to create roughly 3 equal stitches along the edge where you folded it together. Now when you're using an awl, make sure you're continuously rotating it in a drilling fashion, just to make sure that you drill a hole rather than poke a hole in your bark. Once again, we want to use a square awl, just because with a rounded awl, it's not really going to grind away at the bark, but rather just poke right through and once again can cause your bark to split. Before starting, you should have 6 holes drilled for each set of stitches. 3 holes are through the single layer of bark and 3 should be through a double layer of bark. Starting at the bottom, you're going to stick about ½ an inch of root through the whole of a single layer of bark from the outside inwards. The remaining root will go through the double layer next to it from the outside in. You should have 2 ends of root on the inside of your basket now, 1 short end and 1 long end. With the longer end of the root, you're going to put that through the next single layer hole above the previous stitch. Meanwhile, you're going to tuck that ½ inch of root underneath the stitch you're making. It is good to keep in mind that it is easier to put roots through the double layer bark in the same direction that you have drilled your holes. Continue on in that same manner, going into the basket through the double layer and coming out of the basket through the single layer. Once you reach the end, you're going to cut away excess root except for ½ an inch. With that ½ inch of root, you're going to tuck that underneath your last stitch. Repeat this process for the next 3 sets of stitching. Now, when you're folding up your birch bark, make sure that you fold in the same direction just to keep it consistent. So as you can see, Joseph here has folded inwards from both sides. As Joseph is going to be stitching his rim, he's going to sew away from the overlap, which will tighten up the rim and push out the excess. Now, when choosing a root, you want to make sure that you pick one that's a little bit longer. But if it's not long enough, that's okay, because there are techniques that you can use to extend the root and blend it in with your stitching. So first off, Joseph is just going to cut an angle there just to make it easier to get your root through the birch bark and thin it out so that he can tuck it in between the layers of cedar. And to make it easier to sew, you're always going to be pushing your root in through the outside. As well, it's also good to note that you should keep the flat edge against the bark and the rounded edge sticking outwards. And as you can see, just be careful not to have any twists or knots in your stitching to ensure that the root doesn't snap or break. As you're making holes, only drill a couple at a time. You may have to adjust your rim as you are stitching and could cause it to look a little uneven. Another tip, if you don't quite have an eye for measuring, is using a finger to measure the distance between your stitches. For the rim, some people prefer wider stitches and some prefer closer together. You can use whatever distance you feel fit, as long as it holds the rim to the basket. A general note for stitching, try to avoid drilling through the light lines in the bark. These are called lenticels and are weak spots. If you stitch in a lenticel, you might cause your bark to crack. What is neat about them, when you remove the bark off of a tree, is they tend to cling to the tree, so you need to carefully support the bark around them to ensure they don't rip your sheet of bark. As you go along, remove the pegs as your stitching gets closer to them. As well, ensure that the stitches are snug against your rim. Now, if you were to run out of route, this is how you would add more to it to extend and finish up your sewing of your rim. So Joseph is just going to tuck that root right into the rim again. Once that's in place, he's going to trim up the excess. And same as before, thin it out at the tip and insert it into the rim where you've left off. And continue stitching. To finish your basket, you're going to cut off the excess root, leaving only about an inch or so in length. You're going to thin it out like before and tuck it under the rim near where you began your first stitch. And there you have it, a simple Mukuk or birch bark basket. Miigwech for joining us. We hope you enjoyed your time with us today. This has been a Fort William Historical Park Heritage Highlight. I'm Kenny Bochmqua.
And I'm Joseph Rabial.
Saying Giga Wabaman Minowa.